Picture this: a 15-year-old prince lying on his deathbed in a remote Welsh castle, gasping for air as his body burns with fever. His new bride of just 5 months sits helplessly beside him, watching the golden heir to England's throne slip away into darkness. Within hours, he would be dead, and with his final breath, he would unleash a curse that would haunt the English monarchy for over a century. This wasn't just any royal death. This was Prince Arthur of Wales, the perfect prince who was supposed to unite England and Spain, bring peace to Europe, and father a dynasty that would rule for generations. Instead, his mysterious death in 1502 would trigger the most dramatic religious revolution in Western history, destroy multiple royal bloodlines, and prove that sometimes fate has other plans for even the most carefully laid dynastic schemes. Can you imagine being groomed from birth to be the perfect king, only to die before you could even properly begin your reign? Arthur Tudor was everything a medieval prince should be: tall, handsome, educated, and politically brilliant. He spoke multiple languages, excelled in combat training, and had just secured the most important marriage alliance of his generation by wedding Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the powerful Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. But here's where this story gets absolutely chilling. Arthur's death wasn't just tragic. It was the beginning of what historians now call one of the most destructive royal curses in European history. Because when Arthur died in that Welsh castle, he didn't just leave behind a grieving widow and devastated parents. He left behind a succession crisis that would eventually tear England apart, create one of history's most infamous kings, and change the religious map of the entire world. The most terrifying part? Every single attempt to fix the damage caused by Arthur's death only made the curse stronger. His younger brother Henry would marry Arthur's widow, Catherine, thinking he could salvage the Spanish alliance and continue the Tudor dynasty. Instead, that decision would drive Henry VIII into a 20-year obsession with divorce that would split England from Rome forever. If royal curses and mysterious deaths intrigue you, please subscribe to the channel because this doomed dynasty will change how you see fate forever. Arthur's story proves that sometimes one unexplained death can unravel centuries of careful planning and destroy empires. But Arthur's curse was just beginning to reveal its true power. What happened in that Welsh castle wasn't just the death of a prince. It was the moment when English history took its most dramatic turn. The fever that consumed Arthur's body would eventually consume his entire bloodline, and the consequences would echo through generations of Tudor rulers who could never escape the shadow of the prince who died too soon. What you're about to discover will show you exactly how one mysterious death in a remote castle became the catalyst for religious wars, political upheaval, and the end of one of England's most famous royal dynasties. Because Arthur Tudor's curse didn't just claim his life, it claimed everyone who tried to fill the void he left behind. To understand how Arthur's death became such a devastating curse, you need to know just how desperate the Tudor family was to secure their hold on the English throne. Because the Tudors weren't born to rule, they fought, schemed, and murdered their way to power, and they knew that what they had won through violence could just as easily be lost the same way. Henry VII, Arthur's father, had claimed the English crown in 1485 after killing King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. But here's the thing about winning a throne through warfare. Everyone knows you're not the legitimate heir, and every ambitious noble in the kingdom starts plotting to take what you stole. Henry Tudor had about as much royal blood as a medieval peasant, and his claim to the throne was so weak that most experts considered him a complete usurper. This is why Arthur wasn't just Henry VII's son. He was the entire foundation of the Tudor dynasty's future survival. From the moment Arthur was born in 1486, every aspect of his life was carefully calculated to prove that the Tudors deserved to rule England. His name wasn't chosen by accident. Arthur was meant to evoke the legendary King Arthur, suggesting that this new prince would restore England's golden age. But Henry VII knew that names and propaganda weren't enough to protect his dynasty. He needed real political alliances, and that meant one thing in medieval Europe: strategic marriages that would bind powerful foreign rulers to support the Tudor claim. The most important target was Spain, which had just become Europe's rising superpower after Ferdinand and Isabella completed the Reconquista and funded Columbus's voyages. According to diplomatic records, Henry VII began negotiating Arthur's marriage to Catherine of Aragon when the prince was barely 2 years old. Think about that for a moment. Arthur's entire future was predetermined before he could even walk properly. He would marry a Spanish princess, father half-Spanish heirs, and create an unbreakable alliance that would make the Tudor dynasty untouchable. The plan seemed absolutely perfect. Arthur grew up to be everything a medieval prince should be. Contemporary accounts describe him as tall, athletic, and intellectually gifted. He mastered Latin, French, and Spanish, excelled in military training, and demonstrated the kind of political intelligence that impressed foreign ambassadors. Court observers wrote that Arthur possessed the ideal combination of physical strength, mental brilliance, and moral character that would make him a truly great king. But here's where the curse narrative starts to make sense to medieval minds. The Tudors had built their entire dynasty on a foundation of violence and illegitimate claims to power. Henry VII had killed a rightful king to steal his throne, and now he was asking God to bless his bloodline with continued success. In medieval thinking, this was exactly the kind of hubris that invited divine punishment. And the signs were already there for anyone who knew how to read them. Arthur was often sickly as a child, suffering from mysterious fevers and weakness that worried court physicians. Some historians now believe these early illnesses were warning signs of the condition that would eventually kill him. But nobody could have predicted just how catastrophically Arthur's curse would manifest, or how his death would trigger the most dramatic royal disaster in English history. The marriage that would trigger Arthur's curse began with what seemed like a diplomatic masterpiece. In 1501, 15-year-old Arthur finally married Catherine of Aragon in the most spectacular royal wedding England had seen in generations. But from the very beginning, this union was haunted by signs that something terrible was coming. Catherine had arrived in England after a journey that should have been the first warning sign. Her voyage from Spain was plagued by storms so violent that contemporary chronicles described them as supernatural. Ships were damaged, courtiers fell ill, and Catherine herself arrived weeks behind schedule, looking exhausted and shaken. Medieval observers whispered that the seas themselves were trying to prevent this marriage from taking place. But Henry VII was too desperate for the Spanish alliance to pay attention to omens. Catherine brought with her a dowry worth 200 suzerain crowns, an astronomical fortune that would help stabilize the always precarious Tudor finances. More importantly, she represented the approval of Europe's most Catholic monarchs, giving the Tudor dynasty the religious legitimacy it desperately needed. The wedding ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral was designed to show the world that the Tudors had truly arrived as a European royal dynasty. Arthur wore cloth of gold. Catherine was dressed in white silk, with a veil so long it required pages to carry it, and the celebrations lasted for days. Foreign ambassadors wrote back to their courts, describing the magnificence and declaring that England had finally joined the ranks of truly great European powers. But here's where the story gets disturbing. Almost immediately after the wedding, court physicians and observers began noticing troubling signs about Arthur's health. The prince, who had seemed strong and vital during the courtship negotiations, was now showing symptoms that worried everyone who saw him. He appeared pale, tired easily, and seemed to struggle with the physical demands of his new role as a married prince. According to court records, Arthur and Catherine were sent to Ludlow Castle in Wales just months after their wedding. where Arthur would take up his duties as Prince of Wales and learn to govern his future kingdom. This should have been the beginning of their golden years together, a young royal couple starting their life and preparing to rule England and forge the Spanish alliance that would make both kingdoms stronger. Instead, what happened at Ludlow Castle would become one of the most mysterious and devastating episodes in English royal history. Because Arthur's condition began deteriorating almost immediately after arriving in Wales. The prince, who had survived childhood illnesses and grown into a promising heir, was now facing something far more serious, a mysterious sickness that medieval medicine couldn't understand or treat. The most chilling part is that contemporary accounts suggest Arthur himself seemed to sense that something was wrong. Courtiers reported that the prince became increasingly withdrawn and spoke often about death and divine judgment. It was as if Arthur knew that his marriage to Catherine had triggered something that couldn't be stopped. What happened next in that remote Welsh castle would prove that sometimes fate refuses to be controlled by even the most carefully planned royal schemes. What happened to Arthur at Ludlow Castle in the winter of 1501 was so mysterious that even today, medical historians can't agree on what killed him. But the symptoms that began developing just months after his marriage would prove that this wasn't just any illness. This was something that would change the course of world history. Arthur's decline began subtly. Court records from Ludlow Castle describe a prince who started missing official duties, complained of constant fatigue, and developed what physicians called burning fevers that would come and go without warning. But here's what makes this truly chilling. Catherine was living in the same castle, eating the same food, breathing the same air, yet she remained completely healthy. It was as if whatever was destroying Arthur was specifically targeting him alone. The prince's personal physician, Dr. Blaise, wrote detailed letters back to Henry VII, describing symptoms that sound terrifying even by medieval standards. Arthur suffered from violent sweating episodes that would soak through multiple changes of clothing. He complained of severe pain in his joints that made it difficult to walk or even hold a pen to sign documents. Most disturbing of all, he began experiencing what witnesses described as fits of speaking strangely, episodes where he would ramble about divine punishment and the sins of his bloodline. Think about how terrifying this must have been for Catherine, a 16-year-old princess watching her new husband deteriorate before her eyes. She wrote letters to her parents describing Arthur's condition in increasingly desperate terms, begging them to send Spanish physicians who might understand what English doctors could not. But every remedy failed, every treatment made Arthur worse, and the mysterious illness continued to consume the Tudor heir. Guys, if you're loving this journey through royal aberrations, please subscribe to the channel, because what I'm about to reveal next will blow your mind and show you just how far royal dysfunction could go. But the most disturbing aspect of Arthur's illness wasn't just the physical symptoms. It was the psychological deterioration that accompanied his physical decline. Courtiers reported that the prince became obsessed with the idea that his marriage to Catherine had somehow triggered God's wrath against the Tudor dynasty. He spoke constantly about biblical prohibitions and divine curses, as if he understood that his death would be just the beginning of his family's punishment. The winter of 1502 was particularly brutal at Ludlow Castle, and Arthur's condition worsened dramatically as the weather grew colder. What had started as intermittent fevers and fatigue was now a constant battle for survival. The prince, who had once impressed foreign ambassadors with his intelligence and political acumen, could barely get out of bed most days. Contemporary accounts suggest that by March 1502, everyone at Ludlow Castle knew that Arthur was dying. The question wasn't whether the prince would recover. It was how much time he had left, and what would happen to the Tudor dynasty when their golden heir finally succumbed to whatever supernatural force seemed determined to destroy him. What happened in Arthur's final days would prove that some curses are so powerful that they don't just claim their immediate victim. They reach across generations to destroy everyone connected to the cursed bloodline. On April 2nd, 1502, Prince Arthur of Wales died at Ludlow Castle, and with his final breath, he unleashed a curse that would terrorize European royalty for the next century. The circumstances of his death were so shocking and mysterious that within days, rumors of supernatural intervention were spreading across every royal court in Europe. Arthur's death came suddenly after months of deteriorating health. According to eyewitness accounts, the prince had seemed slightly better on April 1st. He had even managed to attend morning prayers and speak briefly with his council. But that night, he was seized by what courtiers described as the most violent fever anyone had ever witnessed. His body temperature became so extreme that servants couldn't touch his skin, and he began convulsing so violently that it took multiple men to hold him down. The most disturbing detail? Arthur's final words were reportedly about his brother Henry and Catherine. Witnesses claim he gasped something about the curse passing to the next, and warned that Henry must not marry her before losing consciousness forever. Whether these accounts are accurate or embellished by medieval chroniclers, they establish the narrative that Arthur's death was connected to supernatural forces targeting his bloodline. Catherine was in the castle when Arthur died, and her reaction shocked everyone present. Instead of the expected grief of a young widow, she reportedly remained eerily calm, almost as if she had been expecting this outcome. Some historians suggest she was simply in shock, but contemporary observers found her composure so unnatural that whispers began spreading about her possible involvement in Arthur's death. Of course, there's no historical evidence supporting these suspicions, but they demonstrate how Arthur's mysterious death immediately created an atmosphere of fear and paranoia. The news of Arthur's death reached Henry VII at Greenwich Palace on April 9th, delivered by a messenger who had ridden non-stop from Wales. Court chroniclers described the king's reaction as complete devastation. He allegedly collapsed upon hearing the news and had to be physically supported by his courtiers. The entire Tudor dynasty's future had just died in a Welsh castle, and Henry VII knew that everything he had built was now in mortal danger. But the shockwaves extended far beyond England. When word reached Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain, they immediately began questioning whether the Tudor alliance was worth maintaining. Catherine was now a childless widow in a foreign country, her political value severely diminished. The French court, always eager to exploit English weakness, began making overtures to Scottish nobles about potential invasions. The Holy Roman Emperor started re-evaluating his diplomatic relationships, wondering if the Tudors would even survive as a dynasty. The most terrifying aspect of the European reaction wasn't just political, it was superstitious. Royal courts across the continent began discussing whether the Tudor bloodline was genuinely cursed by God. Arthur had been the perfect prince, carefully educated, politically brilliant, and physically strong. If someone that promising could die so mysteriously and so young, what did that say about divine approval of the Tudor dynasty? What happened next would prove that Arthur's death wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was the first domino in a chain of disasters that would eventually destroy everything the Tudors had tried to build. If Arthur's death was the first strike of the royal curse, what happened next proved that supernatural forces weren't finished with the Tudor bloodline. Because instead of learning from the tragedy, Henry VII made a decision that would amplify the curse beyond anyone's worst nightmares. Desperate to salvage the Spanish alliance and the massive dowry that came with it, Henry VII began exploring the most controversial solution imaginable, marrying Catherine to his surviving son, Henry VIII. Think about how desperate you'd have to be to even consider this plan. Catherine was his dead son's widow, which medieval Christianity considered practically incestuous. The Bible explicitly forbade men from marrying their brothers' wives, and the Catholic Church required special papal permission for such unions. But here's where the curse really started showing its power. Every rational person in the Tudor court understood that this marriage was dangerous, politically, religiously, and supernaturally. The Archbishop of Canterbury warned that marrying Catherine would bring divine punishment on the Tudor dynasty. Spanish ambassadors expressed concerns about the appropriateness of the union. Even Catherine herself initially resisted the idea, claiming that such a marriage would be cursed by God. Yet Henry VII pushed forward anyway, as if the curse was compelling him to make the worst possible decisions. When he died in 1509, his son Henry VIII inherited not just the crown, but also the obligation to marry his dead brother's widow. And here's the truly terrifying part. Young Henry VIII seemed excited about the prospect. Contemporary accounts describe him as eager to marry Catherine, completely ignoring the supernatural warning signs that had killed his brother. The wedding took place on June 11th, 1509, just weeks after Henry VIII's coronation. It should have been a celebration, but contemporary observers noted disturbing omens during the ceremony. The weather was unusually cold for June. Several courtiers fell ill during the festivities, and there were reports of strange accidents and mishaps throughout the celebration. It was as if the universe itself was trying to prevent this cursed union from being completed. But the most chilling evidence that Arthur's curse was spreading came from Catherine's own behavior. The widow who had remained mysteriously calm during Arthur's death was now showing signs of what medieval observers described as supernatural influence. She became obsessed with having children immediately, as if she understood that time was running out for the Tudor bloodline. She spoke constantly about divine judgment and seemed convinced that her marriage to Henry VIII was somehow connected to Arthur's death. The early years of Henry and Catherine's marriage seemed to confirm everyone's worst fears. Catherine suffered multiple miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths that bore an eerie resemblance to the mysterious illnesses that had plagued Arthur. It was as if whatever supernatural force had killed the first Tudor heir was now systematically destroying any children that might have carried on the dynasty. What made this even more terrifying was Henry VIII's reaction to these repeated tragedies. Instead of recognizing the obvious supernatural pattern, he became increasingly convinced that Catherine was the source of the curse, not understanding that by marrying her, he had made himself the next target of the same mysterious forces that had destroyed his brother. By 1525, Arthur's curse had transformed Henry VIII from a promising young king into a man consumed by supernatural obsession and terrifying paranoia. What happened during these peak years of the curse proved that some royal aberrations can literally drive monarchs insane with fear and desperation. Henry's behavior became increasingly erratic as Catherine continued to fail at producing the male heir he desperately needed. But this wasn't just normal royal frustration. This was something far more disturbing. Henry became convinced that Arthur's ghost was actively sabotaging his marriage and preventing him from having sons. Court observers reported that the king would sometimes be found in his private chambers, arguing with empty air and demanding that Arthur release his grip on the Tudor bloodline. The most chilling manifestation of Henry's curse-induced madness was his treatment of Catherine herself. The woman he had once eagerly married now terrified him because he believed she was somehow channeling Arthur's supernatural influence. Henry became convinced that Catherine was deliberately cursing their children in the womb, causing the repeated miscarriages and infant deaths that had haunted their marriage for over 15 years. But here's where Henry's behavior becomes truly disturbing. He began consulting astrologers, fortune tellers, and even suspected witches, desperately searching for ways to break what he was convinced was a supernatural curse on his bloodline. These weren't casual consultations. Henry was spending massive amounts of royal treasure on occult practitioners who promised to identify and eliminate the source of his family's cursed fate. Contemporary records reveal the absolute peak of Henry's curse-driven paranoia occurred in 1527, when he became obsessed with a specific passage from the biblical book of Leviticus. The verse stated that any man who married his brother's wife would be punished by God with childlessness. And Henry became convinced this was proof that Arthur's curse was actually divine punishment for his forbidden marriage to Catherine. What makes this truly terrifying is how Henry's supernatural obsession began affecting his entire court. He started questioning the loyalty of anyone who had been close to Arthur, convinced that his dead brother's supporters were somehow perpetuating the curse. Several courtiers who had served Arthur were arrested on suspicion of witchcraft. Others were banished from court simply because Henry believed they might be carrying supernatural influence from his dead brother. The curse reached its absolute peak when Henry began experiencing what witnesses described as visitations. Episodes where he claimed Arthur appeared to him in dreams and visions, warning him that the Tudor bloodline was doomed unless he found a way to produce a male heir. These weren't just nightmares. Henry's behavior during these episodes was so disturbing that his personal guards were instructed to restrain him if necessary. By 1529, Henry's curse-induced madness had escalated to the point where he was willing to tear apart the entire structure of European Christianity to escape what he believed was Arthur's supernatural revenge. He began demanding that the Pope annul his marriage to Catherine, not just for political reasons, but because he genuinely believed that remaining married to her would eventually kill him just as mysteriously as Arthur had died. What happened next would prove that when royal curses reach their peak, they don't just destroy individual monarchs, they reshape entire civilizations. Arthur's curse didn't just destroy the Tudor family. It unleashed a religious revolution that tore apart the fabric of European civilization for centuries. What started as one prince's mysterious death in a Welsh castle had now escalated into the most devastating political crisis in English history. When Henry VIII finally broke with Rome in 1534 to annul his cursed marriage to Catherine, he wasn't just defying the Pope. He was shattering a 1,000-year-old religious unity that had held Europe together since the fall of the Roman Empire. But here's what makes this truly chilling. Henry genuinely believed he had no choice. In his mind, Arthur's supernatural curse would continue killing Tudor heirs until he escaped his forbidden marriage, even if it meant destroying Christianity itself. The immediate consequences were catastrophic. The English Reformation triggered religious wars that would rage across Europe for the next century, killing millions of people in conflicts that can be traced directly back to Arthur's death in 1502. The Holy Roman Empire fractured as Protestant movements spread throughout Germany. France was torn apart by religious civil wars between Catholics and Huguenots. Even Spain, Catherine's homeland, found itself fighting constant battles to preserve Catholic unity against the Protestant heresy that had started with Henry's cursed obsession. But the social devastation was even more horrifying. When Henry VIII declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, he unleashed a reign of terror against anyone who opposed his supernatural mission to escape Arthur's curse. Thomas More, one of England's greatest scholars, was executed for refusing to accept Henry's break with Rome. Hundreds of Catholic priests were tortured and killed for maintaining their loyalty to the Pope. Entire monasteries were dissolved, their wealth seized to fund Henry's continuing wars against the curse he believed was haunting his bloodline. The most disturbing aspect was how Henry's curse-driven paranoia infected English society at every level. Neighbors began informing on neighbors for showing insufficient enthusiasm for the king's religious revolution. Anyone who questioned Henry's supernatural justifications for breaking with Rome risked being accused of treason. The entire social fabric of medieval England collapsed as people were forced to choose between their traditional religious beliefs and their loyalty to a king who was convinced he was fighting supernatural forces. Contemporary foreign observers were absolutely terrified by what was happening in England. Diplomatic correspondence from the 1530s shows European ambassadors describing Henry VIII as a man possessed by demonic influences, someone whose obsession with escaping a royal curse had driven him to destroy everything sacred in Western civilization. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V wrote that Henry had become an agent of hell itself, willing to tear down God's church to satisfy his supernatural delusions. But here's the most chilling consequence of all. Arthur's curse was working exactly as supernatural forces intended. Every attempt Henry made to escape his cursed fate only spread the destruction further. His break with Rome didn't free him from Arthur's influence. It amplified the curse's power, ensuring that the religious chaos would continue for generations. By the end of the 1530s, it was clear that Arthur's mysterious death had triggered a complete transformation of European civilization. The medieval world order was collapsing, and everything that came after would be shaped by one prince's supernatural curse. Henry VIII's desperate attempts to escape Arthur's curse ultimately destroyed him in the most horrifying way imaginable. By the end of his reign, the once magnificent king had become a paranoid, diseased monster whose obsession with supernatural revenge had consumed everything he had ever loved or accomplished. The final years of Henry's life proved that Arthur's curse was far more patient and calculating than anyone had imagined. Despite breaking with Rome, executing 2 wives, and terrorizing his entire kingdom in his quest to produce a male heir, Henry never escaped the supernatural forces that had killed his brother. His son, Edward VI, born to Jane Seymour in 1537, seemed like proof that the curse had finally been broken. But Arthur's revenge was just getting started. Edward VI died mysteriously in 1553 at age 15, almost exactly the same age Arthur had been when he married Catherine. The symptoms were eerily familiar: burning fevers, mysterious illnesses that baffled physicians, and a rapid decline that shocked everyone who witnessed it. Contemporary observers immediately recognized the supernatural pattern. Arthur's curse was systematically eliminating every male Tudor heir, just as it had threatened to do 50 years earlier. But the most terrifying proof that Arthur's curse was still active came with Henry's daughter Mary the One, who became queen after Edward's death. Mary was Catherine of Aragon's daughter, the child of the cursed marriage that had triggered this entire supernatural disaster. And her reign became a nightmare of religious persecution and phantom pregnancies that seemed designed to torture the Tudor bloodline with false hopes of continuation. Mary's obsession with restoring Catholic England and punishing Protestant heretics was so extreme that she earned the nickname Bloody Mary. But here's what makes this truly chilling. Contemporary accounts suggest Mary genuinely believed she was fighting Arthur's curse by reversing all of Henry VIII's religious reforms. She thought that by burning Protestant reformers and reconciling with Rome, she could appease whatever supernatural forces had been tormenting her family for decades. The curse's final masterstroke came through Mary's phantom pregnancies. Twice, she became convinced she was carrying the Catholic heir who would restore England to its rightful religious path and finally break Arthur's supernatural hold on the Tudor bloodline. Both times, the pregnancies proved to be psychological delusions. Mary's desperate mind creating the illusion of new life while her body remained barren. When Mary died childless in 1558, Arthur's curse passed to the last Tudor, Elizabeth I. And here's where the supernatural revenge reached its ultimate climax. Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn and the product of Henry's break with Rome, became one of England's greatest monarchs. But she never married and never had children. The Tudor bloodline, which had started with such promise under Henry VII, would die with her. Elizabeth's childlessness wasn't just political calculation. Court observers noted that she seemed genuinely terrified of marriage and pregnancy, as if she understood that any attempt to continue the Tudor dynasty would trigger the same mysterious deaths that had claimed Arthur, Edward VI, and driven Mary to madness. When Elizabeth I died in 1603, Arthur's curse finally achieved its ultimate goal: the complete extinction of the Tudor royal bloodline that had dared to build its power on his death. The ultimate legacy of Arthur's curse is so staggering that it's almost impossible to comprehend. One mysterious death in a Welsh castle in 1502 didn't just destroy the Tudor dynasty. It literally reshaped the entire modern world in ways that are still affecting us today. Think about this for a moment. If Arthur had lived, there would have been no Henry VIII, no English Reformation, no Protestant movement, and no religious wars that tore Europe apart for centuries. America would have been colonized by Catholic England instead of Protestant England, potentially creating a completely different cultural and political foundation for the New World. The entire development of Western civilization was altered because a 15-year-old prince died mysteriously on April 2nd, 1502. Modern historians and medical experts have spent decades trying to solve the mystery of what actually killed Arthur, and their theories are fascinating. Some researchers suggest he died from diabetes, which would explain the mysterious fevers and rapid physical deterioration. Others propose tuberculosis, plague, or even a rare genetic condition that made him particularly vulnerable to infections. The most intriguing theory suggests Arthur suffered from what we now call sweating sickness, a mysterious epidemic disease that repeatedly struck Tudor England and killed its victims within hours. But here's what makes Arthur's case so different from other historical medical mysteries. The supernatural elements surrounding his death were so powerful that they influenced major historical decisions for over a century afterward. Whether or not you believe in actual curses, the fact remains that multiple Tudor monarchs made life-altering choices based on their conviction that Arthur's death had unleashed supernatural forces against their bloodline. The psychological impact of Arthur's curse extended far beyond England. European royal families became obsessed with avoiding similar mysterious deaths, leading to changes in royal marriage customs, medical practices, and even diplomatic relationships. The fear of supernatural revenge influenced royal behavior across the continent, creating paranoia about divine punishment that shaped political decisions for generations. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Arthur's legacy is how modern genetic research has revealed that the Tudors actually did carry genetic predispositions that might have made them vulnerable to certain diseases. Recent studies of Tudor remains and historical medical records suggest that the family may have had hereditary conditions that could explain the pattern of mysterious deaths and reproductive failures that plagued them for decades. The religious revolution triggered by Arthur's death created the foundation for the modern concept of individual religious freedom. When Henry VIII broke with Rome to escape what he believed was a supernatural curse, he accidentally established the precedent that temporal rulers could defy religious authority, a principle that would eventually evolve into the separation of church and state that defines modern democratic societies. So what shocked you most about Arthur's supernatural curse? The mysterious death itself? The way it drove Henry VIII to religious revolution, or how it systematically destroyed the entire Tudor bloodline? Comment below, because I read every single one. And if you want more stories about royal curses and mysterious deaths, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell, because next week I'm bringing you a cursed dynasty that will make the Tudors look lucky. The story of the French royal family, whose curse lasted over 700 years and claimed more victims than any supernatural force in European history.